Chad Tentinger has been surrounded by cattle his entire life. And these days, that means watching his colleagues see shrinking herds and profits. Chad designs and builds barns for them. He started a co-op, and he also plans a huge $500 to $600 million beef processing center in western Iowa. He hopes that this could all lead to more stability, more income, and more potential for small producers. And he thinks some of the higher tariffs that President Donald Trump has discussed could also help. Hi, I'm Dave Price, and this is the American Farmland Owner Podcast. Chad has to put some of the plans on hold as he waits for the cattle industry to recover and hopefully grow. We're going to get into all of that in a little bit, plus where tariffs could come into all this. But first, how cattle became Chad's life. All right, let's start like this. How did your life become all about cattle?
Well, I grew up on a cattle farm. My grandfather raised cattle. My dad raised cattle. Both my grandfathers raised cattle, in fact. And in the 80s, grew up with it as a little boy. We always had cattle around. My grandpa probably had about 1,500, 1,700 head in the 70s and 80s, which was a big number back then. And my dad probably had about 600 to 1,000. So my whole life grew up around it. And it's kind of I often say it's the biggest addiction on the planet. If you're in it, there's no cure for being in cattle. Every once in a while, a bank tries to cure you, but you fight to get back in. So, I mean, it's fun. It's a great life. You love the business you're in. So I grew up in it. Then, after high school, I had a family. It's a hard business to be in, young especially, and coming out of the 80s and the 90s, there wasn't any money in it yet, right? I mean, everybody knows the 80s were horrible, but people forget that the 90s weren't much better. And everybody had to dig out of a monster hole. So my parents didn't have money to just say, hey, boys, come on in. Here's a bunch of cash. Get going. Mm-hmm. So my brother got into cattle business right out of high school on his own, worked his way through it. He had a family later. I had a family right away. So I had to go work construction, do other jobs so that I could stay in the business. And then 20 years ago, I moved down to Des Moines and started a 10 Corp, a construction company. And really, it was all about digging lagoons and helping out, working for cattlemen. At that time, they just passed a law where anything over 1,000 head had to have containment. So we started digging lagoons. Then we did a lot of concrete work. And then we started doing cattle barns. And I think I wasn't really intending to start a construction business that was focused on cattle at the time, but I think my mindset was just so wrapped around cattle, it turned out that way. And so I built the company up so I could stay in the cattle business and grow my cattle business. But once you're in it, if you love it, it's really hard to get out of. You fight every ounce to get in it.
What was that like for you leaving Cherokee for Des Moines? That's a big change, geographically and otherwise.
I moved to Des Moines on West Des Moines on my 29th birthday.
Okay.
I'd met my wife. I'd gone through a divorce and some things like that, and which happens unfortunately when you get married young sometimes. And so I met my wife. She was from she lived in Des Moines at that time, West Des Moines. Okay. She had grown up in Chicago. Then she lived in New York. Then she lived in Seattle, and her job brought her to West Des Moines, which was basically just going to be a layover to a bigger city until she could, with her career. Okay. And I happened to meet her at a friend's wedding. A childhood friend that I grew up with was getting married, wanted a small town wedding in Marcus, Iowa. So my wife and her were co-workers. She was invited up. So I met her in Marcus, Iowa at the community center, and things went from there. So about a year later, I made the decision, we're going to get married. So I decided, I can make this work. So I moved to Des Moines, which at first was a bit of a shift, to be fair. But I kept coming back every week to do farm work. And at that point in time, that's when I started my construction company, because at that shift, I couldn't just be on the farm anymore. Up until then, I was working on the farm every day with my brother and my dad and my grandfather. And at that point, I really had to focus on just construction. I'd always done construction on the side, but at this point, I'm like, well, I don't know if I can really farm anymore. But my wife was certainly not moving. She made it clear she wasn't moving to Marcus, Iowa.
Okay.
Nothing against Marcus. It was just like, you couldn't even comprehend going from a big city to rural Iowa.
Yeah,
So
you're a small time boy. She's big city girl.
yeah, it's the fact that we're together. How we met is unbelievable, but we are. And it's lasted 20 years, so I guess it's going to be okay. But I started 10 Corp at that point, and at that point, I was gone a lot. To be fair, probably 3-4 nights a week. I was back up in Northwest Iowa doing work, and just kept growing from there. But the transition at first was a little difficult. I think now, obviously, I made the right decision. It's worked out really well, and I balance it really, really well. Where I'm in rural Iowa weekly, no matter what. So I get the advantages of on the weekend if we want to go out to dinner or something. There's a lot of opportunity or do things, and then during the week, I still get to experience the life I grew up in.
And Tencor, that's large. That's cattle barns, right?
Yeah, we build cattle barns all over the middle of the country, and we do it everywhere in the country, honestly.
Okay.
So we travel, but we build anything local. We do shops and garages and concrete work and all that, but our main focus is cattle barns, and our main focus is high quality cattle barns. When you're making an investment in a cattle barn, you're spending a lot of money. There's just no way around that. It's an investment into the future. And at 10 Corp, our belief is you're going to pay for something over 15 years, maybe even 20 years. You do not want to make repairs on that building while you're making payments. So you got to start with a high quality building. One of the advantages we have at 10 Corp is I feed all my own cattle in my buildings. So if there's anything that we need to be changed, we've changed things over the years, and it's been changed because the way we feed cattle, we see it firsthand. I think that gives us a big leg up. And then we also know what gets destroyed. These cattle, all they have to do all day is figure out what to destroy. All they have to do. What can I break in this building? So we strengthen everything that we know we can strengthen. And that's our big advantage. We're in the cattle business every day. But we feed the cattle in our barn. So if there was something I needed to do different in the barn, we do it. We do it based on our own R&D, right? Sure. That's the way we've done it.
In getting ready for the conversation today, I was trying to lay out your life, and the only way I kind of know how to do it, I guess, is like if we have some kind of flow chart, and we just use at the top, it's just sort of like generically cattle, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then all of your gazillion things that you're doing just all have one piece underneath. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. 10 Corp as a concept with all the companies, you could just say we're one large cattle company.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We love dealing with farmers. We love dealing with the family farms. We love walking through that process to that we see young people coming back into the system to invest in the future, right? We love that, right? I've said this on a lot of different things, but I've always come back to this. In the 80s farm crisis, parents told their kids, don't farm. There's no money in it. You need to be out of this, right? And it made a lot of sense. There was no money in it. Now, 40 years later, when we're telling young men and women there's no money in farming, that's not factual. There's good money in agriculture. It gets in certain sectors versus the others, but we should not be telling any young men and women to leave the farm in today's world, because there's money in it and it's a great life. You can make a good living. We need to work hard to fix some things. Don't get me wrong, but it really bothers me that we tell young men and women don't farm because there's not a future in it.
And I want to get to a couple other things, but I had talked to you previously about when you were really kind of forming Cattleman's Heritage Beef and how that was going to look like. This is an enormous project, right? Can you talk a little bit about how that's going and ultimately what you're trying to do with it?
So Cattleman's Heritage at its core is just the concept that we need to be working hand in hand, the producer and the packer together, because we can't control retail. We can't control what the box beef price is necessarily, but we can control that when the swings happen in the market, that there's plenty of money for the packer and the producer, right? So that's the core belief in it. And it shouldn't all get divvied up in one side or the other, right? Because it works both ways. If the packer makes too much money and I lose too much money, the system breaks. If I make too much money and the packer loses too much money, the system breaks. It needs to work together. So that's the core concept behind cattlemen's with producer involvement. Vertical integration isn't a bad thing if it's all producer driven. What we don't want to wait around and see is for retail to take over the packing industry, right? Because that would signal to me that we missed a golden opportunity that was ready to make a change, right? So cattlemen's right now, we are ready to go. We are not going to break ground this year because this cattle cycle we're in. It just wouldn't make any sense, I'm not the smartest guy in the room on that by any stretch. I have a lot of advisors that have been in the business for 40 plus years on the packing side. And I listen to them and, there's nobody that's advising us to break ground today. So we have the site.
And all supply based. You got to wait till that starts growing again.
The cattle cycle, we all know the cattle cycle's down. Mm-hmm. We know that the retention of heifers has not happened yet. Until we retain heifers and there's more animals, it'd be too high risk. There's no reason to do, right? Okay. We've got the ground acquired. We've got the blueprints ready. We're 100% approved to break ground. Now, like I tell everybody, we've spent enough money to date. My job today is to protect that money. When we break ground, it's a $600 million project. Then my job becomes to protect that money. And I'm not going to put that at risk. I'm not going to put that at risk because there's an artificial timeline that somebody just says, we got to break ground today, right? Well, indicators don't think we should break ground today, so I'm not going to. So we're patient. We're very patient. We've done a lot of work. We're in a great position. When the timing's right, we'll move forward on it. And in the meantime, we've formed a legacy beef co-op, which will be the supply of cattle to Cattleman's Heritage. And that goes live July 1st. We're with active members, and that's real exciting. I mean, that's another big project that we've been working on for a year and a half. But that will give the family farms, right? We're going to group 520,000 head of cattle together. And what that does is everybody gets to be independent. Everybody runs their own farm. Everybody stays as they are today. But when you're purchasing products, there's value there, right? I mean, a feedlot that buys for 500,000 head of cattle buys a lot different price point than what a 500 head farmer does, right? So what we're trying to do is bring a very competitive price point to the smaller producers so they can save money on the front side. And then on the back side, when we sell these cattle, the goal is to be able to sell these cattle at a better price point also because of the volume. If you can guarantee cattle every week into the system, again, there's better pricing. So by working together, and it's a very great opportunity, every small, medium, and even large, there's not a cattle feeder I know that shouldn't be in this co-op because at the end of the day, by working together, we'll know more and we'll be able to get better price points.
Okay, if I'm following this right, tell me if I get this right. So by doing this with Legacy Beef, you're going to help grow this out, which then helps you for the next phase at Cattleman's Heritage, right? Because is that how this works?
Legacy Beef, exactly right. Legacy Beef Co-op will own Cattleman's Heritage at a certain point in time.
Okay.
That's the goal because that's the producer base, right? When I started this, I had to start the company. So obviously I had ownership to go forward. My goal is to have a certain percentage, but that'll be tied to cattle Legacy Beef Co-op. So it gets a little confusing sometimes, but the goal is to have all the farmers come together, the producers, to actually own Cattleman's Heritage. So I never wanted to set up a system where there was one or two people sitting at the top that was making all the money. We have that system. We don't need to duplicate that. That's in the world today. The goal here is to say, hey, let's bring 300, 400, 500 head farmers together, producers, and everybody makes money together and strengthen our industry.
And so are you seeing, I've seen a few headlines that is it starting to grow out? So we were what, smallest in 50, 60 years, whatever it was. Yeah. Are you seeing indications that it's starting to build again or not yet?
Not yet. Right now, I think 2 months ago, we processed the most heifers we have, in years. So that means that the heifers aren't retained.
Yeah.
And if you're a cow calf guy, sooner or later they'll retain. But the cow calf guy really hits it big, and it's a 10-year cycle. On average, cow calf guy hits it big 2 of the 10. And then there's a few years there where it's like, oh, it's okay. And then there's a few years that are just disastrous. Right? So they're in the part of the cycle where it's really good. And if you're making a good profit, I think it's real hard to say to a family farm like, well, retain that heifer, don't
Yeah.
sell it, take all that money today.
Hmm.
That's a tough conversation, and I don't blame anybody for selling them. That's
Sure.
just good business. Now, at a certain point in time, the heifers will retain. We'll know maybe next year, and when we see that, that'll be an indicator that the herd will be rebuilt, and that will be the tightest part of the market. Though everybody has to remember, when they retain heifers, that will be the fewest head of cattle that we will be feeding. So that's the tightest part of the cycle, and that's coming a year or two out. It looks to be could be 2 years yet before this cycle reverses.
So what makes that change there? What factors go into that?
But what'll happen is the markets will tighten up a little bit, right? And there'll be more grass. The weather patterns change. The ranchers have made good money, and they'll decide, it's time to regrow the herd. I mean, all those factors will come to play, and there'll just be a point where everybody's like, it's time to retain. Time to retain heifers and go forward. It always has happened. Now the herd will never get as big as it was. In the history of this 10-year cycle, it's never grown back to as big as it was going into the cycle. Okay. But interestingly enough, we still have about the same pounds of meat because over the years, we just make cattle bigger.
Yeah.
Genetics change. When I was a little boy, I mean, 1,000-pound heifer would have been a monster, and a 1,200-pound steer was a monster. Now we got 1,800-pound steers and 1,500-pound heifers. So pounds of meat stay the same, relatively speaking. So the cycle will change, and it'll be back to how it is for another 8-year stretch.
All right, you're talking about cycles. So we have so many people in so many industries trying to figure out tariffs. This is not what President Trump is embracing. He did a little bit of that during Trump 1.0. Yeah. Trump 2.0, it's all out, right? And we're going back to maybe a little bit of the mentality from a century ago. I mean, you got to go way, way back. It's hard to, we're not going to find people who were around back then to guide us on this. Yeah. So you're one of the guys at least talking about for your specific industry.
Yes.
You've got some high hopes with this. Can you explain why? Like, why might you be on board with what he's doing, at least for cattle?
Yeah. I'll broaden it just to agriculture, okay. Right? Agriculture, the tariffs that are on our product going to other countries is high, and they play games with it all the time. It seems like, China plays a lot of games with quantities. They make huge points of buying large quantities, and then 8 months later, contracts get canceled, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. On the beef side, we import a lot of lower cuts of beef into this country, and then if we try to go back to those countries with our product, tariffs are high. I'm not saying that we should just, go crazy on the tariffs, but certainly even out the playing field, reciprocal tariffs in agriculture make a lot of sense to me. If I can't sell my product in your country at a fair price, why do you get to bring it into our country at a fair price? And in agriculture, we're lopsided. Over the last 4 years, it got really lopsided. On the beef trade, it was the most lopsided it's ever been. And I think we need to figure it out. The U.S. farmer is the most efficient farmer on the planet. If you want to think about sustainability, which is a big movement, right? Maybe not as big as it was 2 years ago, but it's still a big movement. Nobody in the world is more sustainable than the U.S. farmer. Nobody's more efficient. And what I mean by that, the amount of acres we cover, the amount of cattle we feed, and the amount of product we use, nobody's more efficient. And I'll just give you a real quick example of that. In the state of Iowa, where we feed cattle, how I feed cattle in a barn, my footprint per animal is very small. Right? I'm not using up a lot of grass. I'm not ruining a lot of acres. At the same time, I use that cattle manure. I put it out on my ground. That manure is all my fertilizer now. I don't buy any commercial fertilizer, so I'm not shipping fertilizer around the globe. No. That acre of corn will produce more feedstuffs than the cattle it took to produce the manure. How can you get a better cycle than that? Mm-hmm. So we are actually gaining ground on this. So again, it seems to me like we're the only country getting punished for being more efficient as a producer. So, yeah, I think tariffs in our industry are going to turn out to be a really good thing to level the playing field. Because at the end of the day, everything's a negotiation, and it'll all come to pass. And if we get our exports opened up into more countries at fair markets, I think it's a great thing. We've all heard for years about the gray market, right? If beef can't get into one country, well, it's getting there. It's just got to go through another country because they have tariffs or they have regulations that prohibit us going direct there. those things hurt our family farms. And it should change.
Short term, it could be challenging for folks. Fair?
Could be, but I look at a big picture here, and I'll use cattle right now. It's great. So prices are high. Cattlemen are doing well. I think pork's struggling a little bit more, but the pork industry struggled for the last 5 years. So it would be real hard for me to say, well, tariffs did this today. Well, what did it last year? What did it the year before that? Corn and beans. We had the Ukraine war obviously disrupted the markets. So we saw $7 to $8 corn. Yeah. But before tariffs were coming on last year, corn had dropped down into the low fours. So corn's relatively the same price today it is today as it was pre-tariff talk. So is that what's causing it or not? But I've sold a lot of cheap corn in my life when there was no tariffs on. So it's hard for me to now say this is this one policy and that's why it's low. Probably was going to be low anyway.
For cattle, it's what, Brazil
and Australia.
Australia, Argentina or not?
Yeah, there's some Argentina, but Brazil would be a big one, right? And they ship a lot of the lesser product in that is combined with our high quality meat, especially on the food services and on the hamburger, right? So one could argue to keep prices lower, you ship all that meat in here because it's lower quality and it's cheaper. Mm-hmm. Well, that's only really good if we have access back with our high quality cuts into those same markets. Because if they're taking their high quality cuts and selling it in markets we should be going into and then shipping their low quality into us, well, ultimately that's a big negative to the U.S. farmer, right? So we've got to figure out these trade agreements. And if tariffs are the way to negotiate them, then it is what it is. But I'd rather go through a few year cycle where it's tough and fix the problem permanently. And, I think we owe it to this administration, to be fair. I mean, we voted wholeheartedly. And I don't know if we all knew this is exactly what it was going to be, but I think knew there was going to be disruption in the markets. I think it's a little disingenuous to try and judge it on 100 days. I mean, let's give it 6 months to a year and see what comes out of it. And hopefully it's a lot better. In the last decade, we've been rattled in markets nonstop. And it's just, it's hard for me to say that there's going to be producers and farmers that are going to go out of business because of the policy that's been enacted for the last 3 months, considering, look at all the producers that have gone out of business in the last decade. So what caused that? Unfair practices.
So how do you judge this time-wise? 100 days isn't very long. There are multiple schools of thought about how this president operates, right? He's all about figuring out a deal, negotiating. Some people think, I've used this example here on the podcast a few times, but there was a senator from North Dakota who said kind of his style is you walk into a crowded room, you drop a grenade, blow it all up. He walks out. And then his team goes in there and tries to pick up what's going on, and you cobble together something, right? It's kind of this shock to the system thing. So how does this play out when you're talking about tariffs? Do we have to go through the shock for a few months and then it settles into where we've got a better playing field? Is it longer term where we're going to have to really jack up the reciprocal tariffs, and then our folks may have it tough if they're losing export possibilities for a while? How does this have to work?
I think by the end of this year would be a fair time to kind of start judging. Are we making progress? Are we going the right way? Right? It takes a year, minimum of a year. I mean, in this level, I build businesses based on a 3-year belief system that it takes 3 years. When you start a business, by the time you're at the end of 3 years, you're either successful or you should abandon that business. Well, I don't think we have 3 years on this kind of a level, to be fair. But I think by the end of this year, we're going to know if we're heading the right direction. At the end of the day, if we end up having more manufacturing in the U.S., I'm 100% for that. I think it's disingenuous for us to sit over here and say we love these cheap products, knowing full well it's basically slave labor in most of these countries. Pick a lane you want to be in, but I'm not for slave labor. And I also think, let's not pretend like it's 1940s and 1950s where these factories are going to take thousands of people stand on the line. It's going to be robotics, right? Mm-hmm. We're going to have very efficient robotic driven factories that are going to build these products. Even in the last 20 years, 10 years, look what that's changed. So I think we can have manufacturing and have cheap products because, it will be a lot of robotics. And I think some people are going to push back and say, well, then you're not going to increase employment. Well, we're pretty much 100% employed today. I mean, if we can build factories here that don't require 1,000 people, that require 25, 35 people to make sure the robotics is running, I think that's a great thing. I don't know why anybody would be against American-made products and against, we should be against of the labor practices in other countries just from a standpoint of what we believe in as a country. I think is fair.
Can you, and I'm sorry, I kind of pushed you off this going into another topic. There are a couple other things I wanted to ask you about and I appreciate that you're kind of pausing this thing with Cattleman's Heritage Beef right now, but can you dig into the concept of what this is going to be ultimately? Because some of this is kind of lessons learned from COVID, right?
Yeah. So Cattleman's Heritage will be producer owned. The boards will sit together. They will work together. Legacy Beef Co-op and Cattleman's Heritage might be the same board by the time we get there, right? In a perfect world. So it will be driven by the producers and the board members that they elect to make decisions on what's best for both sides of that aisle. Historically, when a producer makes money, a packer loses money. When a packer makes money, a producer loses money. At the end of the day, we're trading margins back and forth between these two sectors. It makes a lot of sense to bring the sector together and work together. So that at Cattleman's, it's a waiting game for the markets to come around, but it will be controlled by producers and really work for family farms. And ultimately it'll give the small producers a level playing field to work in this system. In the South, we already know what that looks like, right? In the South, it's large feedlots that work directly with packers to supply cattle. It's a great system. I'm not against that system. And in the South, that's how it was developed. In Iowa, in Nebraska, in Minnesota, in South Dakota, in northern Missouri, it's small producers that feed the system. And we just kind of have to decide as an industry, do we want to keep all our small producers and our family farms and our rural areas and our small towns alive? Or do we want to consolidate? It's either going to consolidate at the packing level, and it will consolidate either at some point in time, all those small farmers are gone and there's 5 people in this area that control the cattle, or do we want 1,000 people doing what they've always done? It's a decision the industry's got to make. I've made my decision. I want to see all the farmers out here. I want to see the producers. It's good for business at every level. It's good for our neighborhoods. It's good for our tax basis. It's good for everybody. But we're going to have to make a decision as a state, as in the industry too. Are we going to do something that makes sure that we have longevity for the family farms? And we'll see.
So what you're laying out here, this would describe both of your grandpas, right? What they used to be back in the day, right? You'd be looking out for them. So you fundamentally believe in this, but at the same time, you're putting this big project on hold because that's what the market dictates. Like that can't be easy for you because you don't want time to tick away here, right?
Yeah, no, it was fundamentally, I like to go, like I drive. So for me to pause, I have a lot smarter people than me that work for me as advisors that have 40 years plus in the cattle industry. So when they come together and they say, you can't break ground today because this cattle cycle is not over, when we open our doors, there's a cost. When you start, you're going to have a plant that can do 2,000 a day. On day one, we'll try and get 5 old cows through the system and see if there's anything sellable out the back door. Well, that's a big loss that day.
Yeah.
But on day 60, maybe you're trying to get 300-400 head through this system, right? So it builds. So no matter whether we start a plant or any other company in the country starts a plant, there's a cost to starting a plant up, and it's a heavy cost. You have that figured in your budget, and you go forward. Right now, boxes are losing money. The packers are losing $150 a head on boxes. So if you would couple that loss when you open your door with your natural losses, I don't know of anybody that could. That's a hard one. It's just simple math, right? Yeah. If you lose $100 million on top of your operating cost on year one, that's a tough. You better have some deep investors behind you. And by waiting a year, if you got to wait 2 years, that's fine. Everything's ready to go. It doesn't go away. We're still operating. We still have our employees. We're still doing the work every day. Patience will be rewarded. The worst thing we could do is panic, dive into it no matter what, because somebody has an artificial timeline that's not judged on fundamentals, but just saying, well, you should be going. And I mean, I think the best way to lose control of something is to lose endless cash on year one. And then, the plant would always be there, but it would not be owned by farmers. And at the end of the day, the last thing I want to do, we have a lot of farmers that are invested in this. There's going to be a lot more when we break ground that'll be invested in this. I don't want to lose their money. That's my number one job, is to not lose their money. And at the end of the day, I don't want to have to go back to them and say, hey, y'all have to kick in the same amount of money this year.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a good business model. So we have to be patient. We know the business plan. We have an incredible business plan put together, again, by a lot smarter people than me that have been in the business for a long time. And we just have to wait for that business plan to develop for the right timing. That's all.
All right.
I hear a lot about that every day. Well, why aren't you going yet? Why aren't you going yet? I'm like, well, because nobody wants to risk 600 million. And, that's Vegas.
Yeah.
I'm not going to Vegas and gambling that. So we'll be patient.
Hey, close us out with something fun. The best steak you've ever had was where?
Oh boy. That's a hard one. I've had a lot of great steaks all over the country. I know the go-to is always, everybody wants to say, the best steak I ever had was pulled out of my freezer on a Saturday afternoon, but I've had some great ones. Don't get me wrong, but I'll stay true to the hometown market. For me, if I'm going out for a great steak, 801.
801 in downtown Des Moines, Iowa. Okay.
It's a great steak if you're in the area. But boy, there's so many good ones out there. I've been blessed to travel a lot. And you get in the Chicago market, there's about 6 places out there it's unbelievable. But that would be my answer. The best one, probably in the local market. I'm a big fan of 801. I love that.
How do you order it?
I'm a medium guy.
Okay.
When I was a young man, it was all medium rare. Now I'm a medium guy, and I know I'll get some flack for that, right? But because
I'm with you. My son is medium rare. And medium's kind of right there for me.
I tell you, I'm a big believer in whatever you just eat beef, eat steak, however you like to cook it. If you like it, enjoy it. That's how you should. It's the same as whiskey. Everybody gets snobby on bourbon and whiskey and how you should drink it and whatever you like. It's like, tell you what, however you enjoy it is how you should drink it. So however you like your steak is how you should eat it.
Exactly. Chad, thank you so much. We appreciate the thoughtful conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Check out our profile piece about Chad in our weekly American Farmland Owner newsletter. It's the place where landowners get their news. Maybe you're thinking about buying your own farm, investing in one, or just want to learn what's going on in this world that impacts the places that feed and fuel our nation. Go to AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Thanks for joining us here on the podcast. And thanks for caring about the future of our farmland.